Okay, wait, before you click off, this isn't one of those videos where I list off a bunch of specs and then tell you it's not about the camera, you can shoot off your iPhone, what really matters is the person behind the camera. No, okay, none of that crap. I've owned the Sony a6500 for over 5 years and it's been basically my main photography and video camera. And today I will be going over all the pros and cons of whether you should consider getting this camera or not in 2022. So, image quality. Does the Sony a6500 hold up in 2022? Yes and no. As you can see, if you know what you're doing, as in you know how to expose properly, you know to have the correct shutter speeds and the correct ISO and aperture, and that goes for any camera, you can create some very beautiful images. The reason why I say no is because the 1080p is extremely soft. That's due to Sony's bitrate. I think it shoots like 100 megabits per second. I almost never use it. The only time I would ever use it is if I need to shoot slow motion at 120 FPS or 60 FPS. If you care about image quality, I would not recommend shooting in 1080p. Another pro about this camera is actually the size. I've shot with the FX3 and the FX6, and I have to say the FX6 is huge. Like, it is heavy. At least for my kind of filmmaking style, I don't think I would ever want to carry such a big camera. But the Sony a6500, I really do appreciate the size when it comes to just run and gun filmmaking. One of the pros is that this camera has a viewfinder, which is actually extremely important if you also want to do photography. The screen on this a6500 is terrible. If you're out midday in the sun and you're trying to expose looking at the screen, like, good luck. If you're thinking that's only for photography, you know, and I shoot video, unless you have an external monitor connected to your camera for, you know, checking exposure and all your levels, I would highly recommend having a viewfinder, because many times I would actually use the viewfinder to see if my exposure levels and everything is correct for filming. The final pro about this camera is that it has IBIS built in. It gets rid of all those micro jitters. So whether you're taking photos or videos and you're doing a lot of handheld stuff, add on a lens that has optical stabilization, it will help tremendously. Something that the Sony a6400 doesn't have. I think the Sony ZV-E10 also doesn't have built-in state, does it? All right, so enough about the pros. Let's focus on some of the cons. So one of my biggest issues I have with the Sony a6500 is the terrible rolling shutter. And that's simply because the readout speed of the camera is just not fast enough, because it's basically scanning a 6K image, and that's a lot of processing to do. So, you know, it's understandable, but if you're into vlogging, that's not gonna be very helpful. So one of the other biggest downsides about the camera is the fact that it only shoots in 8-bit. Now, if you're wondering what I mean by 8-bit color, 8-bit color means that the camera captures 16.7 million different colors, which sounds like a lot. But if you compare it to 10-bit, there are 1 billion different colors that are captured. If you are, let's say, color grading your footage, if you're only working with 16 million colors, you will very quickly realize, as you're trying to push the image towards a certain look, that the image begins to fall apart. Compared to 10-bit footage, you will have much more room to stylize and push the colors in different directions. A lot of times the way I dealt with 8-bit footage is try to get as much as you can in camera, right? You don't want to have like the wrong white balance and, you know, the wrong picture profiles, and, you know, you're gonna think like, hey, I'm just gonna fix it in post, like, it's fine. No, make sure you get everything as much as you can correctly done in camera. That way you don't have to push the 8-bit footage around. So some of the other cameras you're probably considering are the Canon M50 Mark II, the Fuji X-T3, the Sony ZV-E10, which is their newest APS-C camera, as well as the Sony a6400 or the Sony a6600. So a buddy of mine actually had the Canon M50 Mark II, and I got to play around with it, and it does produce pretty good 4K image quality. However, there are two things to consider. Number one, there is a crop on that 4K. And number two, I believe the dual pixel autofocus doesn't work in 4K. They have a different type of autofocus. I believe dual pixel autofocus only works in 1080p. One of the issues with the Canon M50 Mark II was the fact that the autofocus had issues depending on the lens that was attached to it. Now, my friend had the Sigma 16mm f1.4, which is honestly one of the greatest lenses you can get for an APS-C sensor. And unfortunately, that lens just has issues with that camera body. Also, this video is actually being shot currently with that Sigma 16mm f1.4. So the other cameras you would consider are basically in the Sony lineup. So one of the reasons why I would not recommend the a6400 or the ZV-E10 is due to the lack of IBIS. Because they all share the same sensor, that means they all have the terrible rolling shutter. So if you plan on vlogging, because of how bad the rolling shutter is and the jello effect that the Sony a6500 produces, and that is with IBIS, I cannot imagine without IBIS what that would look like. If it already doesn't look good on the Sony a6500, why would it look good on two cameras that don't have IBIS? It'd probably look worse due to the micro jitters. But the advantages that the ZV-E10, the a6400, and the a6600 have are the better autofocus. So if you need like really good autofocus for whatever reason, those are probably the way to go. But that doesn't mean the Sony a6500 has bad autofocus. I've relied on this camera's autofocus for weddings or even talking heads. As you can see right now, I'm actually relying on autofocus. So it's pretty reliable. One other advantage that the ZV-E10, the Sony a6400, and the 6600 have are HLG profiles. Basically, it's combining the best of both worlds where you have the log aspect in the profile. So the reason why you want to shoot in log is because it gives you more dynamic range. But the downside of that is log profiles tend to be more flat. When you're color grading the images, you're going to have to bring back those colors that wasn't there straight out of camera. And because of the 8-bit depth that you are working with in these cameras, okay, so if there's a jarring cut in this video, the camera actually overheated in the middle of filming, but that is another con that this camera has. I also have a external monitor that is connected to it, and I believe that that also could be one of the reasons why my camera overheated. This camera does have a record limit of 30 minutes. The Sony a6400 and this a6600, as well as the ZV-E10, do not have record limits. That also could be a huge determining factor if you do plan on shooting documentaries, talking headshots, or stuff that requires you to film for longer than 30 minutes. Okay, so as I was editing the video, I quickly realized I never really touched base upon the Fuji X-T3 or the Panasonic GH4 or the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K. The reason why I didn't really talk about the Pocket 4K is because it's more of a cinema camera. That requires usually more than one person to operate, or you have to buy additional accessories, and it's really not the run and gun type of filmmaking camera. If you're looking at this video considering the Sony a6500, then you're probably somebody who wants to take photos or who are more into vlogs or talking headshots like this. But if you are looking to be more of a professional filmmaker, then absolutely consider the Pocket 4K. The reason why I don't really recommend the Panasonic GH4 is because the GH4 is a micro four thirds sensor. It's even smaller than the APS-C size sensor in the Sony a6500. So there's two reasons why you don't want a smaller sensor. Number one would because it performs worse in low light. The smaller the sensor size, the less light it can absorb. Number two would be less bokeh. As you can see right now, there's quite a bit of shallow depth of field, which is this blurriness. And the smaller the sensor size, the less bokeh you will have. The other downside of the GH4 is the fact that it relies on contrast-based autofocus, and unfortunately, it's just not that great. But one of the positives of the GH4 is the fact that it does shoot 10-bit 422 internally. If you treat it more like a cinema camera where you use manual focus instead of relying on the autofocus built in, I would say it's a pretty good cinema camera. But for most people, vlogging probably wouldn't do the trick. Now, the Fuji X-T3 has an APS-C size sensor, which is the same found in the Sony a6500. It shoots 4K 60 and it has 10-bit 422 internally, and that honestly is amazing. The only downside is that the autofocusing system really just isn't as good compared to, say, Sony's autofocusing system or Canon's autofocusing system. Okay, so to sum up this entire video, who is this camera for? If you're gonna shoot vlogs, I really wouldn't recommend this camera. A few reasons would be because number one, it has terrible rolling shutter, does not have a flip out screen, only has the screen that kind of comes out like up and down. It doesn't even fold all the way up like the Sony a6400 or the 6600. So your best bet would be the ZV-E10 because it actually has a flip out screen that comes out to the side. If I had to be honest, I wouldn't recommend any of these cameras simply because of how bad the rolling shutter is. It's really just not an ideal camera for vlogging. If I had to pick a vlogging camera, I'd probably go with like the Sony ZV-1. It has a flip out screen. It probably doesn't have that bad of a rolling shutter. For the price, it honestly is like an all-in-one package. One thing to consider, because the Sony a6400, 6600, ZV-E10, or the 6500, they all require additional lenses, right? So if you're just buying the body, do keep in mind that lenses are also expensive, like the Sigma 16mm f1.4, which I would highly recommend, and this sits at about like 500 bucks. So if you want to shoot vlogs, ZV-1 is probably the camera I would recommend, because vlogs aren't necessarily, you know, very high quality focused. It's more about the convenience. If you're doing a more cinematic vlogs where you set down a tripod and you do like talking heads and all that, with not a lot of movement and walking around, then yes, consider the 6400, the 6500, or the 6600. If you are going for more documentary and more cinematic videos like filmmaking, consider the 6600 or the 6400. The a6500, if you can get it for a good price, it's pretty solid. Out of all the cameras, the best all-arounder would probably be the Sony ZV-E10. A6600 is technically the best camera out of all of them because it has the viewfinder, it has IBIS, has HLG, and it has good autofocus, but it's also the most expensive. For the price of like $899 or like something like that for the ZV-E10, that's probably your best bet. Yeah, if you find this video helpful and not confusing as hell, hit the like button, subscribe, comment down below. This is my first video where I kind of just talk without a script. Hopefully when I'm editing this video, I can make sense of it. If not, rip to future me. See ya.